Greetings, friends. You are on the channel of Ruslan Belov. Today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of March 17, 2025. A huge number of very interesting events have taken place today. Before we begin, I would like to sincerely ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription helps the channel grow. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. Let's start with the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the armed forces of the Russian Federation have launched what appears to be a truly large-scale offensive. Today, on March 17th, the Russian Ministry of Defense, in its latest report, announced that the Dnieper troop group has established full control over the settlement of Stepovoy through active operations. This is a small village, Stepovoy, located north of the settlement of Pyatikatki. Just a few days ago, there were reports of clearing operations in Pyatikatki itself, and there was even footage showing Russian soldiers raising a flag in the northern part of this small village. The flag was raised as early as March 12th. Here is the footage. And starting from March 12th up to today, March 17th, the Russian army has been actively advancing further north towards settlements such as Stepovoy, Malye Shcherbaki, and Shcherbaki. Already today, the majority of pro-Russian military experts, bloggers, cartographers, and generally anyone who is more or less interested in this situation, have announced another breakthrough by the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the defeat of Ukrainian units, and so on and so forth. Let's now try to understand what exactly is happening in these settlements, Stepovoy, Malye Shcherbaki, and Shcherbaki. And in general, let's try to answer the question: is the offensive in the Zaporizhzhia direction really the main goal and objective of the armed forces of the Russian Federation? Before we begin, of course, I would like to remind you that in 2023, just before the offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces on the Rabotino sector of the front in the Zaporizhzhia direction, the Russian army had already established control over each of these villages. Stepovoye, Pyatikatki, Lobkovo, Shcherbaki, and Malye Shcherbaki were already under the control of the Russian armed forces, and at that time, this attack allowed the Russian army to gain a significant amount of time, and possibly that maneuver at the forefront of the Ukrainian counteroffensive allowed the Russian Federation to subsequently defeat the 100,000-strong grouping of the Ukrainian armed forces. This, in principle, is a small backstory. There is already objective control footage from the territory of the settlement of Malye Shcherbaki. That is, there is already a significant amount of material available online that confirms the confident control of these villages by the Russian armed forces. Now, we ask ourselves the question: is this truly a large-scale offensive towards the settlement of Zaporizhzhia, or is it some kind of maneuver, a diversionary maneuver, aimed at drawing Ukrainian reserves and units to this sector of the front, or is something else being planned? Let's try to figure it out. The first question that probably concerns everyone is whether this offensive is aimed at capturing the settlement of Zaporizhzhia. If we talk about the prospects of this offensive, I would like to immediately note that for the successful completion of the Zaporizhzhia offensive operation, at least 100,000 troops are needed. These 100,000 troops should already be in Crimea, where rotation is taking place, Tokmak, Melitopol. This is where 100,000 people should already be gathered, who will appear on the battlefield, wave after wave, with the aim of advancing towards Zaporizhzhia. But again, this is a huge settlement, a city of 1 million people, with serious industry concentrated here. This is not Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, compared to Zaporizhzhia, is just a village, let's say, some kind of Constantinople, where battles are currently taking place, compared to a settlement like Pokrovsk. It's nothing. That is, Pokrovsk and Zaporizhzhia are two operations that cannot be compared. Moreover, if the Russian army is indeed planning a further offensive, then of course it will be difficult to do without some kind of special operation, similar to the one we observed in Sudzha, or in Hostomel, or near Kiev. That is, of course, the best and most ideal option for the Russian army units would be to somehow take control, encircle the entire settlement of Zaporizhzhia, specifically outside the city itself, that is, somewhere to the west, northwest, north, and northeast. A certain encirclement ring should be established that would cut off all supply routes. And while this encirclement ring holds, Russian units gradually advance from the direction of Vasilivka and Orikhiv towards the city itself, the capital of the Zaporizhzhia region. But we understand perfectly well that organizing such an operation will be extremely difficult. Of course, there is another option. If, for example, we are not talking about the complete capture of Zaporizhzhia, but only about its part, the part that is on the Russian side of the Dnieper River. In this case, of course, it is necessary to destroy all bridges to cut off supplies. Also, to advance from the direction of Vasilivka and Orikhiv, the shortest distance, in order to establish fire control with FPV drones over all possible pontoon bridges and crossings that the Ukrainian side will undoubtedly start building immediately. But even such a maneuver implies further penetration into the defense of the Ukrainian armed forces and further advancement, say, even to the southern outskirts of the settlement of Dnipro. Well, the southern outskirts, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but in any case, a semi-encirclement of Zaporizhzhia should be carried out. And of course, the question arises again. Is this feasible at this stage of the special military operation? Well, without knowing what trump cards Gerasimov currently holds, as well as the units stationed on this sector of the front, and based on preliminary information from open sources, it seems to me that this information appears highly unrealistic. Then the question arises, why has the Russian army begun actively advancing in this sector of the front? To answer this question, of course, we need to take a step back and look a little further ahead. Let me remind you that tomorrow, March 18th, 2025, a phone call will take place between the President of the Russian Federation and the President of the United States, Donald Trump. This information has been confirmed today by various pro-Russian sources and, of course, by Peskov. During this call, the issues of a ceasefire, territorial concessions, and, most importantly, the issues that Trump recently highlighted will be discussed. Some common ground has been found on most issues. According to Trump, 2 issues remain, which he emphasized during his interviews. These are the issue of access to the Black Sea and the issue of a large nuclear power plant. He did not name the specific plant, but we all clearly understand that Trump is referring to the fact that Ukraine has 2 key issues: access to the Black Sea and the question of who will control the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant after the conflict ends. By raising this issue and understanding that the territory of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as the city of Energodar, is under the control of the Russian armed forces and the Russian Federation as a whole, Zelensky hints that they would not mind considering this settlement as part of an exchange fund or some other deal to transfer the city and the plant to the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. And of course, this brings us back to the question of cards, of trump cards, and who holds what. Let me remind you that just before the start of the Sudzha operation, say 3 weeks ago, Zelensky, or rather from the perspective of the Russian Federation, Ukraine and Zelensky, had several trump cards. There was the first, the second, and the last trump card. Why the first, the second, and the last? Why not the first, second, and third? Because the first trump card for Ukraine was control over the Sudzha salient, control over the territory of the Russian Federation, which could later be exchanged for the territory of the settlement of Energodar, along with the nuclear power plant. That was Ukraine's first trump card. The second trump card was the presence of long-range drones, as well as territory in the northern part of the Sumy region and the northeastern part of the Chernihiv region. This is the sector of the front from which strikes have been launched deep into Russian territory over the past few months, primarily targeting the city of Moscow, the capital of the Russian Federation. In this case, the distance from this salient, from this sector to the capital, is no more than 500 kilometers. That is the second trump card, this small area of Ukraine from which strikes have been launched. Just a few days ago, 337 drones were launched against Moscow. And of course, if this situation continues, it will be extremely difficult to defend Moscow, despite the successes of the air defense systems in all previous cases. As production increases, the effectiveness of air defense will inevitably decline. That was the second trump card. And then, of course, comes the last trump card. Why the last? Because the Russian side does not know if there are any other cards, any other trump cards between the two we have discussed, and the last one. Why is it called the last? Because if it is used, everything will change. A completely different story, and a completely different course of events will unfold, which no one in this world will be able to control. And then extremely difficult and tough decisions will have to be made, both by the Russian Federation and the United States of America. So, what is this last trump card? Today, a very important and very interesting law was passed in Ukraine. A very interesting law. According to this law, the Ukrainian side is allowed, during martial law, to use its own armed forces on the territory of foreign states if such deployment or use would, let's say, resolve issues of territorial integrity, as well as issues of sovereignty, and align with the national interests of Ukraine. That is, starting today, March 17, 2025, Ukraine has the right to use all its armed forces stationed along, let's say, the border with the Russian Federation, along the line of contact from Kherson Zaporizhzhia to Luhansk Donetsk. Now these troops can be used elsewhere. And of course, as soon as this law was passed, as soon as this situation was approved today, March 17th, on the eve of the phone call between President Putin and President Trump, we clearly and perfectly understand that the main purpose of this law, at least its public demonstration, is to show Ukraine's intention to use its last trump card. That is, in fact, there may be no third, fourth, or fifth cards left. There is only the last one. Here it is, the last one, and now it's time to decide, are you ready to escalate to this level, or will we still resolve the issue of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? So, if we talk about deploying troops on the territory of another state, then of course, in adopting this law, the Ukrainian side is primarily guided by the presence of a separate region in the southwestern part of Ukraine called Transnistria, where the Russian contingent is stationed, where Russian peacekeeping forces are located. And in general, the Ukrainian side can now legally use its troops in this region to defeat the Russian contingent stationed there, seize and take control of the stockpiles and weapons depots located there, and of course provide a kind of service to Chisinau by restoring the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the state of Moldova. And of course, for now, this is just muscle flexing. But it is being done deliberately so that tomorrow Trump can discuss this trump card with President Putin during their phone call. The logic is simple, either Transnistria or the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is where pressure will be applied to the Russian Federation, and it will be very interesting to see how this story ends. In general, it now becomes clear, and this explains why, in my understanding, the Russian side is essentially forced to launch an offensive in the Zaporizhzhia direction. The goal of this offensive is to prevent and disrupt possible operations by the Ukrainian armed forces in the Transnistria region, as by advancing towards Zaporizhzhia, anything can be expected from Russian units, so it is necessary to maintain serious reserves and forces here to prevent further advances. At the same time, the Ukrainian side will not be able to deploy these forces elsewhere on the front. Now let's return to the Zaporizhzhia direction and clearly understand where the Russian army will move next. At the moment, the distance from the settlement of Shcherbaki to the settlement of Novoandreevka is 8 kilometers across open, well-fortified terrain. Further movement towards the settlement of Pavlovka along the road from Malye Shcherbaki is also across open terrain, approximately 7 kilometers and 620 meters, give or take. Additionally, if we look at the situation where the Russian side might advance from Stepovoye in a northwestern direction, again with the aim of bypassing Kamenskoye from the northeast, east and north, the distance here is at least 9 kilometers. If the Russian army continues its offensive in this sector, it will need to cover these enormous distances across open terrain. And under conditions of, let's say, complete air control with the use of FPV drones, this is very difficult to achieve. But we are, of course, observing how the situation will develop. It will be very interesting to see if the Russian army will advance further. But I repeat once again, it seems to me that the main goal of this offensive is a diversionary maneuver and preventing any provocation, especially a bloody one, in the Transnistria region, as we can see that Ukraine has decided to use this moment again. This is a very serious card because, if we reason objectively and talk exclusively about the military operations that have been conducted, we must understand that if the Ukrainian side introduces a contingent into Transnistria, violating all possible ceasefires and the status quo of this region, then of course it will be extremely difficult for the Russian side to restore stability and prevent a collapse of the front in this small, unrecognized republic. Next, we move to the line of contact. There are a couple of very important video moments that were published over the past day. Let's start with the Chernihiv region. Today, Russian sources published footage of Iskander strikes on concentrations of Ukrainian armed forces units in this sector of the front. Here we can observe a fairly large concentration of Ukrainian armed forces in a small forest near the settlement of Semenovka or near the settlement of Kuty-Vtoria. As a result of the Iskander strike, an entire group was destroyed, and this is not the first strike along the border. In general, we see that there is some kind of concentration here, and let me remind you, this region is one of Zelensky's trump cards. He uses this sector of the front, this salient, as the shortest distance for strikes on Moscow. Next, we move to the Sudja district, where the Russian army is gradually continuing to clear positions of the Ukrainian armed forces still within the Sudja district. The main fighting today unfolded in the area of the village of Guieva. Just yesterday evening, Russian units, using a drone, raised the Russian flag on the highest structure in the southern part of this village. The flag, as you can see, was installed using a drone. And perhaps someone will say that this flag means nothing because it was not raised by soldiers. But you know, I just read a very interesting article. If we talk about flags installed by drones, then in the military language of the units stationed along the line of contact, this gesture, this symbol, means that one side or the other is establishing full control over the airspace. That is, the installation of the Russian flag on the southern outskirts of Guieva indicates that Russian drones have reached here without any problems, and even if there are Ukrainian armed forces units in Guieva, this is a clear signal to them that drones are already far to the south and that there is no point in holding out here for long. Even if a retreat begins, Russian drones are already flying several kilometers deeper towards Gornyal. That is, this is primarily about control of the sky. And so, based on these footage, as well as footage from individual mapping services, over the past day, Russian units have managed to finally clear Guevo as well, although the information from the northern group of forces of the Russian Ministry of Defense has not yet been confirmed. Combat operations also continue in the area of the settlement of Oleshnya Hoholevka. But perhaps for the first time since the fighting began in this sector of the front, we have received no updates at all. That is, we can see that the pace of the offensive was initially quite high, then gradually began to slow down. And today, perhaps for the first time since the start of the Sudja counteroffensive, we have had a day with no updates at all regarding the front line in the Hoholevka and Oleshnya area. This also speaks volumes. On the other hand, we continue to receive a large amount of footage of destroyed Western-produced and Ukrainian-produced equipment in the Sudja region. A large number of trophies, weapons and equipment, some damaged, some intact, some destined for scrap metal, some to be disassembled, and so on. The Russian army is currently collecting a large number of trophies, and it is possible that the main units of the Russian armed forces are currently occupied with this process. At the same time, the destruction of Ukrainian equipment along the H07 highway continues. Equipment is moving, but we can see that it has no chance. Everything that enters the H07 highway is immediately detected and destroyed by Russian units using fiber optic drone technology. There is also information that the Ukrainian side has decided to copy or replicate some of the tech know-how invented by Russian units. This involves the installation of net coverings, protective domes over all supply routes. This footage comes to us from the Sumy region. Here we see how Ukrainian engineering units are hastily installing poles that will later be covered with nets to minimize losses of equipment and personnel from strikes by FPV drones using fiber optic technology. This technology was first used en masse on the Bakhmut-Artemivsk direction, along the Artemivsk-Ivanivka-Kostiantinivka highway. There were many photos of this, and the Russian side was still building these structures when the snow fell. Now, Ukrainian units have begun to gradually copy the experience of the Russian side. Next, we move to the Chasiv Yar and Toretsk sectors of the front. Over the past day, a large number of geolocations from the settlement of Chasiv Yar have been published. And, based on the concentration of these geolocations, FPV drone strikes and artillery strikes, the first thing that comes to mind is that the Russian Federation, after completing the Sudja battle and redeploying units back to various sectors of the front, such as Chasiv Yar, Toretsk and Pokrovsk, may be beginning to increase the pace of the offensive in key directions, such as Siversk, Chasiv Yar and Kupiansk. That is, we may soon receive more and more information from the Kostiantynivka direction. Neutral and pro-Ukrainian cartographers continue to confirm the advance of Russian units towards Novomarkov. Let me remind you that the Russian Ministry of Defense announced the clearing of this village last week, but without any objective control footage. So far, all cartographers and experts are in no hurry to update their maps, possibly assuming that the Ministry of Defense made some mistake in that report. But for now, we are waiting and watching. In the settlement of Toretsk, the Russian side continues stabilization efforts. Today, very important map updates were published by the pro-Ukrainian mapping service Deep State. Very important footage. Here we can see that the Russian side has indeed managed to stabilize the situation. Counterattacks are underway, pushing back Ukrainian units. The most important thing to note from the map of pro-Ukrainian mapping services is that there is not a single area in the settlement of Toretsk that is under the confident control of the Ukrainian armed forces. The entire Toretsk is divided into two areas. Either the territories are under the confident control of Russian units, and these territories are constantly expanding, or the territories are in a grey zone. This indicates that control in these sectors of the front is 50-50. That is, according to pro-Ukrainian mapping services, Ukrainian formations do not have confident control over Toretsk. Next, we move to the southwestern Kostiantynivka direction. We are also receiving an increased number of geolocations from the settlement of Tarasivka. We can see that after counterattacks by the Ukrainian armed forces over the past 2 weeks, the Russian side managed to repel them. It is possible that the Russian side is completing its regrouping and may soon activate on this sector of the front with the aim of further advancing towards the settlement of Novolenivka, as well as towards the settlement of Alexandropil. That is, based on the geolocations, we can assume where the Russian units will move next. Next, we move to the Pokrovsk sector of the front. The geography of the fighting here has not changed for about a month. The same settlements, Uspenivka, Udachne, Kotlina, Zvereve, Pischane, and Shevchenko, are mentioned in the reports of the Russian Ministry of Defense, and geolocations are only coming from these points. We continue to receive objective control footage of FPV drone strikes on the forward positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. That is, the front line here has also stabilized after attempts by the Ukrainian armed forces to launch counterattacks at the end of February and beginning of March. But it seems that the Russian side is currently in a brief pause, waiting for reinforcements that may soon arrive from the Sudzha region, after which the Russian side will resume its offensive operations, possibly with the aim of further encircling the settlement of Pokrovsk. Next, we move to the southern Donetsk direction, towards the settlement of Velika Novosilka. Over the past day, some mapping services have slightly adjusted their maps in the area of the settlement of Vesele. Both pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian cartographers, as well as neutral ones, note a slight advance towards the southern outskirts of the village of Vesele. It is possible that in the coming days, Russian units will gain a foothold on the southern outskirts, and fighting will begin for the settlement itself. The main objective of the Russian units in this sector of the front is to reach the settlement of Komar, through which several main logistical routes pass. If these roads are cut, the Russian units will have a unique opportunity to cut off the Ukrainian armed forces grouping located in the area of Otradiv, Bohatyr, and Rozliv from supplies from the mainland. This would then lead to another operation by the Russian armed forces' eastern and southern groupings of forces, aimed at encircling and enveloping Ukrainian formations in the area of Alexandrivka and trapping this Ukrainian armed forces grouping in a cauldron. That's all the news for today. Thank you for watching.